The quiet hum of the dehumidifier was the loudest sound I typically heard, a constant companion to the rustle of vellum and the whisper of turning pages. In the vast, cool expanse of the municipal archives, nestled deep beneath the city's oldest library, I, Cole Jensen, found my solace. My days unfolded with the predictable rhythm of a metronome, cataloging, preserving, deciphering the faded script of forgotten eras. Each document was a whisper from the past, a fragment of truth waiting to be carefully reassembled. My hands, calloused from years of delicate handling, moved with practiced reverence over brittle edges and ink-stained surfaces. Today, the task was a collection of early municipal planning documents, recently unearthed during a renovation project near the old quarry. They smelled of damp earth and time, a rich, ferrous scent that promised untold stories. I worked methodically, donning my thin cotton gloves, arranging the brittle parchments under the soft glow of my archival lamp. Outside, beyond the thick stone walls, a biting winter wind scoured the city, but here, only the past breathed. One particular roll, bound with a thick, unraveling twine, felt heavier than its size suggested. It bore no clear label, only a smudged, illegible seal. Carefully, I untied the knot, the coarse fibers crumbling to dust between my gloved fingers. The parchment unrolled with a reluctant sigh, revealing a meticulously rendered blueprint. It depicted a structure I didn't recognize, certainly not one from our city's recorded history. The lines were impossibly fine, drawn with a precision that bordered on obsession, detailing what appeared to be an ancient watchtower or perhaps a lighthouse, though its location was conspicuously absent. I leaned closer, my breath held, tracing the labyrinthine corridors and spiraling stairs with my gaze. The architect, whoever they were, had possessed an extraordinary command of perspective and scale. The detail was breathtaking, the shading masterful. My initial thought was one of quiet admiration. This was a true find, an architectural marvel lost to time. Then, a flicker of discord. My eyes snagged on a particular section, a circular room at the apex of the tower. It seemed to expand inward, a visual trick of the draftsman's hand, perhaps. I adjusted my lamp, sharpening the focus. No, it wasn't a trick. The room's interior dimensions, as indicated by a series of precise, annotated measurements, were significantly larger than its exterior footprint. I blinked, a frown creasing my brow. My mind, usually a well-ordered library of facts and figures, snagged on the anomaly. I knew architectural conventions, understood spatial logic. A room could not be larger on the inside than its outside. It was a foundational truth, as immutable as gravity. Yet, here it was, rendered with an undeniable clarity. I picked up my magnifying glass, the heavy brass cool against my palm, and scrutinized the lines. Each stroke was deliberate, purposeful. There was no erasure, no sign of error. The figures were clear, unambiguous. I checked the scale key, a tiny diagram at the bottom of the parchment. It was standard, consistent with the rest of the drawing. I double-checked the measurements, comparing them against the indicated scale. My internal calculations confirmed it. The room defied Euclidean geometry. This wasn't a mistake, it was an intentional, precise depiction of something that simply could not be. My determination, usually a quiet strength, now felt like a desperate need to impose order on a sudden, unsettling chaos. I cross-referenced the script with known architectural notations, searching for any obscure symbol, any forgotten code that might explain this incongruity. Nothing. The symbols were familiar, the measurements conventional. I leaned back, my gaze fixed on the impossible room. The parchment felt suddenly heavier, imbued with a strange, latent power. My mind raced, sifting through centuries of architectural theory, of construction techniques, of every known structural limitation. This blueprint, so meticulously crafted, was a lie. Or, rather, it depicted a truth that shattered every other truth I held. Outside my reinforced window, a vast expanse of frozen lake stretched towards the horizon, a mirror reflecting the pale winter sky. Its surface, a crystalline sheet of solid water, was a testament to the world's rigid, predictable laws. The lake froze when the temperature dropped, thawed when it rose. Simple, unwavering. I spent the next hour re-examining every line, every annotation, my initial professional curiosity hardening into a relentless pursuit. I felt a growing tightness in my chest, a subtle pressure behind my eyes. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was a deliberate challenge to my understanding of the world. And I, Cole Jensen, a man whose life was built on the rock-solid certainty of facts, felt the first tremor of that rock beginning to crack beneath my feet. The hum of the dehumidifier, once a comfort, now seemed to mock me with its indifferent drone. The quiet hum of the dehumidifier, once a soothing drone, began to fray at the edges of my perception. It seemed to pulse, to stretch, then contract, mimicking a distant, irregular heartbeat. Days bled into a single, extended vigil in the municipal archives, my world shrinking to the glow of my desk lamp and the whispering pages. The initial spark of fascination had ignited a fervent, almost desperate need to understand. I was no longer merely cataloging, I was hunting. My fingers, stained with the faint ochre of ancient dust, traced the impossible lines across countless blueprints. A 17th-century fortification, intended to guard the city's harbor, depicted a bastion with an internal chamber that simply did not connect to any other part of the structure. No entrance, no egress, just a sealed void rendered in meticulous cross-section. Sometimes, a faint, metallic tang would bloom on my tongue, an inexplicable flavor that vanished as quickly as it appeared. I dismissed it as fatigue, as the dry air, as anything but what my gut insisted it might be. Yet, the distortions grew. The lines of text on vellum would occasionally swim, not from my eyes blurring, but as if the ink itself wavered, a brief, liquid dance before settling back into rigid script. Once, I saw a shadow cast by my own hand on a document seem to stretch, thin and elongated, reaching beyond the natural limits of the light, before snapping back. The unease, initially a subtle prickle, sharpened into a persistent thrum beneath my skin. My colleagues, if they noticed my increasingly gaunt appearance and the frantic gleam in my eyes, said nothing. They were ghosts in my periphery, their movements a blur I barely registered. My focus was absolute, my world confined to the endless, perplexing tapestry of these impossible designs. I began to see them everywhere. Not just in architecture. A diagram of ancient irrigation channels, supposedly charting the flow of water, showed a nexus point where the currents converged and simply stopped, absorbed by nothing. These were not drafting errors, the precision was too stark, the consistency too unnerving. It was a pattern. A grand, terrifying, and utterly cohesive pattern. The impossible chamber in the bastion, the self-consuming stairwells, the vanishing irrigation, the bottomless mine shaft, they were fragments, echoes of a singular, overarching design. A blueprint for something that could not exist, yet was meticulously documented across centuries, across cultures, across entirely unrelated fields of human endeavor. It was as if different hands, separated by vast gulfs of time and space, had each glimpsed a piece of the same forbidden puzzle and committed it to paper, unknowingly contributing to a colossal, unspoken truth. My breath hitched. This was not an academic curiosity. I needed air. I needed distance from the suffocating weight of these revelations. I left the archives, the heavy steel door clanking shut behind me, the sound echoing unnaturally long in the silent corridor. The city above was a blur of muted lights and distant traffic, but I sought a deeper quiet. My steps carried me without conscious direction towards the city's edge, to the vast, open expanse of the frozen lake. The wind, a bitter blade, scoured my face as I stood at the shore. The frozen lake stretched before me, a vast, white plain under a bruised sky, its surface a mosaic of cracks and ridges. I stared at the intricate network of fissures in the ice, the way they branched and intersected, some disappearing beneath opaque white patches, others extending to the horizon. And there, in the stark geometry of the frozen water, I saw it again. The same impossible angles, the same self-intersecting lines, the same structures that defied all logic, all physics. The world around me, even this desolate expanse of ice and sky, was beginning to sing the same impossible song. I turned, the wind whipping my hair, and began the long walk back towards the library, towards the depths where the truth, or what was left of it, awaited. The metallic tang, once a fleeting phantom on my tongue, began to assert itself with a more stubborn insistence. It was not merely a taste now, but a presence, a subtle hum in the air that seemed to thicken the very oxygen I breathed within the archives. The grand, silent halls, usually a sanctuary of dust and forgotten whispers, now felt charged with an unnameable energy, a nascent pressure that pressed against the inside of my skull. I found myself pausing, mid-catalog entry, listening for a sound that never quite materialized, searching for a shift in the light that always remained steadfast. My colleagues, absorbed in their own meticulous tasks, seemed oblivious, their faces placid under the diffused glow of the reading lamps. The architectural anomalies, once confined to the abstract geometry of the blueprints, began to bleed into the physical world. A corner of a shelf, when viewed from a particular angle, would seem to ripple, the wood grain momentarily shifting like water under a breeze. The ancient binding of a tome, its leather familiar under my thumb, would momentarily feel alien, its texture akin to dried, flaking skin. I would blink, rub my eyes, and the world would snap back into its expected order, leaving me with a faint tremor in my hands and a prickle of cold sweat on my nape. I was determined to find a pattern, a logical explanation for these fleeting distortions, convincing myself that it was the strain of long hours, the optical illusions born of poor lighting. One afternoon, while scrutinizing a particularly perplexing diagram depicting a vault with impossible, non-Euclidean angles, the air around me grew dense, almost viscous, and the metallic taste bloomed in my mouth with an overwhelming bitterness. The intricate lines on the parchment began to vibrate, not subtly, but with a violent shimmer that warped the very paper. A sound, low and guttural, like stone grinding against an unseen force, resonated directly within my inner ear, bypassing the drums, shaking the very bones of my skull. I looked up, my gaze tearing from the document, and the grand reading room around me seemed to buckle. The towering shelves, laden with centuries of recorded history, swayed inward, their perpendicular lines bending into soft, organic curves. The ornate ceiling, usually a bastion of stable plasterwork, rippled like a disturbed pond, its intricate moldings dissolving and reforming into patterns that defied logic, shifting geometries that pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence. The faces of my colleagues, just moments ago absorbed in their work, became blurred, their features elongating, their skin taking on the texture of wet clay. Their movements slowed, became jerky, like figures trapped in a collapsing film reel. A gasp caught in my throat, a dry, choked sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, a desperate, childish act, willing the horror away. The grinding sound intensified, a choir of unseen stone giants groaning in unison. The metallic tang became a searing burn. When I dared to open my eyes again, the room had reasserted its familiar, stoic order. The shelves stood rigid, the ceiling firm, my colleagues once again sharp and focused, their pens scratching softly, their pages rustling. No one had reacted. No one had flinched. The archivist, a man of quiet diligence, looked up, his brow furrowed with mild annoyance at the interruption. "Hear what, Cole?" he asked, his tone perfectly normal, utterly devoid of the horror I had just witnessed. Only the wind outside, perhaps. The wind. I shook my head, a slow, disbelieving movement. He hadn't seen it. He hadn't heard it. The terrifying spectacle had been mine alone, a private, monstrous unveiling. The air outside was crisp, cutting, a clean balm against the lingering metallic taste that still clung to my tongue. The vast expanse of ice, a mirror to the bruised twilight sky, stretched out, silent and unmoving. Here, at least, was solid ground, a landscape of undeniable reality. Or so I desperately hoped. I walked to the very edge, the brittle reeds crunching under my boots. The ice, thick and unyielding, reflected the last vestiges of daylight, a canvas of subtle blues and purples. I stared at my own reflection, a distorted figure in the uneven surface, and for a terrifying second, the reflection shifted. The image held for a breath, then snapped back, merely my own anxious face staring back from the ice. Even here, in the stark, open expanse, the unseen forces found purchase, twisting the familiar into something monstrous. Something fundamental was breaking. The anomalies were not confined to ancient texts, they were seeping into the world itself, or perhaps, into my perception of it. The next morning, I returned to the archives earlier than usual, driven by a new, relentless urgency. I bypassed the casual greetings of the morning staff, my gaze already fixed on the section of forbidden texts. I was alone in this, a solitary explorer charting the dissolving boundaries of existence. The need to understand, to uncover the truth behind the impossible geometries and the fleeting distortions, had transcended academic curiosity. It was a desperate, all-consuming hunger, pulling me deeper into the labyrinth of forbidden knowledge, regardless of the cost to my sanity, regardless of the cracks that continue to spread across my reality. The metallic tang, a constant companion now, hinted at a deeper truth, a taste of something vast and ancient, always just beyond the veil. Echoes from beyond the chasm yawned, a silent, ravenous maw between my perception and his. The casual dismissal from the colleague, a gentle wave of the hand, had not merely brushed aside my words, it had erased the terrifying spectacle from his reality, leaving it solely within the confines of my own. I stood there, a lone sentinel on the precipice of an unfolding horror, while the world around me remained stubbornly, maddeningly mundane. The wind, he'd said. A trick of the light. But the geometry I had witnessed, the impossible angles twisting into existence on the frozen lake, were no trick. They were a revelation, a monstrous unveiling meant for my eyes alone. A cold certainty settled within me, heavier than any stone. If no one else could see, then the burden, and perhaps the key, rested with me. I turned from the archival office, the fluorescent hum suddenly grating, the familiar scent of old paper turning stale. The air outside bit at my exposed skin, but the chill was a welcome counterpoint to the burning conviction in my gut. I would not be deterred. The truth, however grotesque, beckoned. I moved through the familiar aisles, my hands tracing the spines of countless volumes, but my gaze was sharper, more desperate. My mind, a meticulous cataloger by trade, began to sort through not just what was present, but what was absent. The gaps, the inconsistencies, the curious lacunae in the historical record. The air grew heavier, dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through grimy windows. I was looking for something that shouldn't be there, something that defied the logic of a meticulously maintained historical repository. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth surface of aged vellum, brushed against rough, unpainted brick in a section I'd always assumed was merely a dead-end wall. A faint tremor, a resonance almost, hummed beneath my palm. Pushing against the brick, I felt a slight give. It wasn't solid. With renewed vigor, I pressed harder, running my hand along the mortar lines. There. A hairline crack, almost invisible, outlined a section of the wall. It was a door, disguised with masterful deception, blending seamlessly with its surroundings. My breath hitched. This was it. This was the chasm I needed to cross. With a grunt, I forced the hidden panel inward. The air that wafted up was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like old blood, and a strange, almost electrical tang. The stairs were rough-hewn stone, uneven and slick with a fine layer of moisture. The light from the archives above receded, consumed by the encroaching gloom. At the bottom, a vast, low-ceilinged chamber unfolded, sprawling beneath the main building. It was not a conventional storage area, this was a vault, an underground bunker, forgotten and forbidden. Dust motes, disturbed by my entry, swirled in the beam of my phone's flashlight, revealing shelves unlike any I had seen. They held no numbered boxes, no neatly labeled files. I approached the nearest shelf, my heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Here, bound in what felt like dried, stretched hide, were books that defied conventional typography. Their pages were not paper but thin sheets of polished obsidian, etched with symbols that writhed and shifted in my peripheral vision. One such tome lay open, displaying a diagram of impossible geometry. Lines converged where they should diverge, planes intersected at angles that contradicted Euclidean space, and within the impossible structure, I discerned a faint, almost imperceptible pulsation. Architect. My gaze fell upon a small, smooth artifact resting beside the book. It was a sphere, crafted from a material that absorbed light rather than reflected it, yet shimmered with an inner, faint luminescence. As I reached for it, a jolt, not physical but psychic, coursed through me. My vision blurred, the cavernous room dissolving into a kaleidoscope of shifting angles and impossible depths. I saw it again, the frozen lake, but now the crystalline surface was not merely fractured, it was folded, like paper, into an intricate, alien origami. And within those folds, a vast, unblinking eye, not of flesh but of pure, crystalline structure, slowly opened. Pattern. Structure. The lake, the eye, the architectural entity. It was all connected. This hidden archive was not merely a collection of records, it was a testament, a warning, a key. I stumbled back, the visions receding but leaving behind an indelible stain on my perception. The air in the bunker felt thick with a presence, ancient and indifferent. My hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of the knowledge I had just absorbed. I was no longer merely cataloging history, I was uncovering the scaffolding of existence, and it was not built for human eyes. The determination in me had solidified, but it was now laced with a frantic desperation, a terrifying clarity that screamed of impending doom. I had found what I sought, and in doing so, I had begun to lose myself. The chasm yawned, a silent, ravenous maw between my perception and his. I stood there, a solitary sentinel at the edge of an abyss only I could witness, the metallic tang of fear blossoming on my tongue. The mundane hum of the archive around me, the gentle rustle of paper from a distant desk, seemed a mockery, a fragile veneer over the unspeakable truth I had glimpsed. My steps back to my own section of the archive were heavy, each one a conscious effort against a growing internal resistance. The blueprints, the ancient texts, they called to me, their forbidden geometries whispering promises of understanding, even as they threatened to dismantle the very scaffolding of my sanity. I gathered my satchel, the weight of the rolled parchment within feeling less like a burden and more like an anchor, pulling me deeper into uncharted waters. The thought of leaving them, of abandoning this unraveling mystery, was unthinkable. The truth, however horrific, demanded its witness. The walk home, usually a familiar rhythm of pavement and brick, became a disquieting ballet of the almost right. A lamppost, usually on the left, now stood sentinel on the right. A certain storefront, its faded awning a landmark in my mental map, seemed to have swapped places with the bakery next door. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, attributed it to fatigue, to the lingering shock of the chasm, to the insidious doubt the colleague's obliviousness had sown. The world felt soft at its edges, pliable. Inside, the silence was deeper than usual, a velvet cloak that absorbed sound. I set my satchel on the worn wooden table, the blueprints still nestled within. My gaze drifted to the corridor leading to my study, a path I had traversed countless times. It seemed longer, the perspective subtly warped, as if viewed through a convex lens. The framed print of a solitary ship on a storm-tossed sea, a gift from my grandmother, usually hung precisely in the middle of that stretch. I walked the length of the corridor, counting my steps, then walked it again. The print did not move. It was fixed, yet my memory screamed a different placement. This was no trick of light, no weary delusion. This was wrong. A thirst gnawed at me. I moved towards the kitchen, a space I could navigate blindfolded. But the refrigerator, a behemoth of white enamel that had stood in the same corner for a decade, was gone. In its place, where the back wall should have been, a narrow archway now opened onto a small, tiled antechamber I had never seen before. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away slowly, my hand reaching for the solid oak of the kitchen counter, only to find my fingers closing around empty air. The counter was there, but my hand had simply passed through where it should have been. I needed to focus, to ground myself. I turned back to the living room, to the comforting presence of my books. My armchair, a deep leather haven where I spent most evenings, was no longer facing the window. It had rotated, now angled towards the far wall, its back to the street. The window itself. It wasn't the window I knew. Instead of the familiar brick facade of the building opposite, the bustling street below, and the distant city skyline, there was only a vast, silent expanse of white. A frozen lake, stretching to an indistinct horizon under a sky the color of bruised plums. The ice was ancient, scarred with fissures like a fractured mirror, reflecting the bleak light in 1,000 splintered angles. A single, skeletal tree, barren and gnarled, stood solitary on the far bank, a stark silhouette against the desolate backdrop. No wind stirred the air, no sound carried across the impossible distance. It was a vista of utter desolation, and it had swallowed my city whole. My mind reeled. This was not a painting, not a projection. This was there. This was outside. My own reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and terrified, superimposed over the desolate expanse. I spun around, a desperate pivot, seeking the stability of my familiar home. The antechamber was gone. The refrigerator stood once more in its rightful place. The corridor to my study was of normal length, the prints centered perfectly. But the frozen lake remained, an impossible tableau beyond my window, mocking the sudden restoration of the interior. A laugh, raw and bordering on a sob, escaped my lips. My home, my sanctuary, had become a living deception, a labyrinth of shifting realities. The walls were no longer boundaries but fluid membranes, the very architecture of my life a cruel illusion. The ancient blueprints had not just revealed hidden spaces, they had unlocked a mechanism that was now consuming my own. I was alone, adrift in a reality that bent and broke at the whim of an unseen architect, and the gnawing certainty settled in my gut, there was no escape. The chasm had been a wound in the world, a rent in the fabric I'd always taken for granted. The colleague's tranquil ignorance, his casual dismissal, was a colder dread than the void itself. It wasn't that he couldn't see it, it was that he wouldn't. Or, perhaps, it was that the world had simply chosen to edit itself for him, leaving me as the sole, terrified witness. I stood there, rooted in the fading memory of a room that now felt utterly alien, the air thick with an unspoken, unspeakable truth. I had to move. The compulsion was a raw, gnawing thing, pulling me away from the archive, from the sterile order that had once been my sanctuary. My steps echoed too loudly in the hushed corridors, each sound a stark declaration of my solitary madness. The city outside offered no solace. Its familiar contours felt stretched, its buildings leaning at impossible angles when I dared to glance at them too long. I walked, a phantom limb of my former self, drawn by an instinct I couldn't name, only obey. Hours dissolved into a haze of pavement and shifting light. The surface, a sheet of polished ice, shimmered under the weak afternoon sun, reflecting the bruised sky in 1,000 fractured fragments. I walked onto the lake, my boots crunching on the thin layer of snow that dusted the ice. Each step was a commitment, a foray into the heart of this desolate, beautiful mirror. The air was sharp, biting at my exposed skin, but I barely felt it. My gaze was fixed on the ice, its translucent depths hinting at the dark water beneath. It was a canvas, vast and empty, waiting. And then, it began. At first, it was merely the play of light, the distortions inherent in a surface so uneven. But then, a distinct pattern emerged, not on the ice, but within it, as if etched into its very core. A face. It was indistinct, blurred by the frozen medium, yet undeniably human. A woman's face, her features soft, a gentle curve to her lips. My mother. Or what I remembered of her. I knelt, pressing a gloved hand against the frigid surface, my breath misting. The image solidified, gaining clarity, yet it was not quite right. Her eyes, which I remembered as a warm, reassuring brown, were now an unsettling, glassy blue, reflecting the sky with an alien intensity. A smile, once comforting, now seemed to stretch too wide, too thin, a mask of affection rather than genuine warmth. The face pulsed, a slow, rhythmic distortion, like a faint heartbeat within the ice itself. Then, another face emerged, overlapping the first, shimmering into existence beside it. My father. His stern, familiar brow was furrowed, but the lines were too deep, like cracks in porcelain. These were not memories. These were invasions, carefully crafted mockeries. The entity wasn't just showing me things, it was reaching into the very root system of my identity, twisting the anchors of my past. My parents. The foundational stones of my existence. More faces began to appear, swirling in the ice, a horrifying kaleidoscope of fractured memory. A beloved teacher, his wise, patient smile replaced by a grotesque rictus. Each visage was a subtle violation, a quiet undoing. Event, one face, in particular, solidified with a horrifying clarity. It was a face I had seen only in old, sepia-toned photographs, a distant relative I'd never met, a great-aunt perhaps, her image filed away in the dusty corners of my mind. But this face, though undeniably hers, was young, vibrant, and her eyes, though still holding that familial glint, seemed to bore directly into me with an intensity that transcended time. Not then. Not now. Reveal/discovery, the words, spoken in my own internal voice, shattered something within me. This wasn't just distortion, it was a profound, terrifying revelation. The entity had been there, subtly present, woven into the fabric of my earliest memories, observing, perhaps even influencing. The faces weren't just images of loved ones, they were projections of its past interactions with my past. The great-aunts. Face, speaking with my voice, implied a connection far deeper, far more insidious than I had ever dared to imagine. It wasn't just attacking my sense of self, it was claiming a part of my very formation. I staggered back, the ice groaning beneath my feet, a sound like the world itself sighing in despair. The faces multiplied, a silent chorus of accusing eyes and twisted smiles, pressing in on me from every angle. My past, a carefully constructed narrative, was dissolving, replaced by these unsettling, intrusive visions. Had any of it been real? Had I ever been truly real, or merely a stage upon which this elder presence had played its long, patient game? It affirmed the insidious presence, a woven thread in the earliest tapestries of my mind, observing, perhaps even whispering the very thoughts I believed my own. The face, an impression rather than an image, haunted the periphery of my vision, a ghost of a memory I couldn't quite grasp, yet felt deeply. It was a catalyst, sharpening the edges of my resolve even as it dulled the sheen of my sanity. I had to understand. I had to impose order upon this encroaching chaos, to dissect the impossible with the precise scalpel of reason. Ancient blueprints, brittle and yellowed, lay unfurled beside my own frantic sketches. I traced lines that defied Euclidean geometry, structures where parallel planes converged, where volumes existed without defined boundaries, where the inside seemed to spill into the outside with effortless, horrifying grace. My fingers, stained with ink and graphite, trembled as I measured, calculated, and then recalculated, each attempt a desperate plea to the universe for consistency. I sought the hidden algorithm, the secret language that would unlock these impossible spaces, believing that if I could just find the underlying rule, the terror would recede. Hours bled into days. I built crude models from cardstock and string, trying to manifest the concepts. A wall that was also a ceiling. A corridor that looped back upon itself while extending infinitely. Each physical manifestation, however rudimentary, failed. The paper would tear, the string would tangle, refusing to hold the impossible forms I willed them to represent. It was as if reality itself recoiled from the very idea, shattering my constructions into pathetic fragments. The entity, I felt, watched these futile attempts, an indifferent observer to my intellectual agony, perhaps even finding a perverse amusement in my struggle. The truth began to coalesce not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, glacial creep, a frostbite of the mind. It wasn't that my methods were flawed, it was that the very principles I relied upon were inadequate. The blueprints weren't anomalies within a Euclidean universe, they were blueprints of a non-Euclidean universe. My reality, the one I had always known, was merely a thin, fragile skin stretched over something vast, something utterly alien and indifferent. The calculus of madness wasn't about solving for x, it was about realizing x was a variable in an equation I couldn't even begin to comprehend, an equation that mocked every axiom of my existence. A profound weariness settled into my bones, heavier than any physical exhaustion. The world felt too small, too predictable, yet also terrifyingly unstable. I walked without purpose, my boots crunching on frozen earth, until the landscape opened before me, the vast, unbroken expanse of a frozen lake. The surface was a sheet of pewter, reflecting the bruised, winter sky. Cracks, like delicate veins of shattered glass, spiderwebbed across the ice, stretching into the distant, hazy horizon. I stood at the edge, my breath pluming in the frigid air, and for a moment, a profound quiet settled over me, a balm to the clamor in my skull. Then, I looked closer at the cracks, at the way they intersected, the way one line would seem to vanish beneath another only to re-emerge, subtly shifted, further along. It was there, on the indifferent canvas of the frozen lake, that the final, devastating revelation struck me. The cracks weren't just random fissures, they mimicked the impossible lines of the blueprints. The ice, a solid, tangible thing, seemed to fold, to curve in ways that defied its flat surface. A ripple in the distance, a trick of the light, twisted the reflection of the sky into a spiral that shouldn't exist, a point of infinite regression. My mind, stripped bare by relentless logic and its subsequent failure, suddenly saw. This wasn't a universe governed by straight lines and fixed points. It was a fluid, pliable thing, capable of bending and breaking its own rules, rules that humanity had merely assumed were fundamental. The vastness of the frozen lake became a metaphor for the universe's true, terrifying nature, immense, beautiful, and utterly without care for the tiny, fragile beings who built their understanding on flawed geometry. My sense of self, my memories, the very face that haunted me, they were all just temporary constructs, built on a foundation that could shift and collapse at any moment. The entity wasn't just in my memories, it was the very force that allowed them to exist, a sculptor of the illusion. Hope, a flickering ember I had desperately tried to fan, was extinguished. There was no scientific method, no logical calculus, no human framework that could contain this truth. The face, an impossible geometry of shadow and light, etched itself onto the raw surface of my waking mind. It was the impression of something vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent, yet eerily familiar. A strange, insistent pull drew me from the confines of my studies, away from the familiar scent of aged paper and the comforting weight of forbidden texts. My feet moved, unbidden, through the brittle morning air, toward the shimmering expanse I knew lay beyond the town's forgotten edges. The scent of pine needles, usually sharp and clean, now carried the metallic tang of old blood, a taste that spread like a rust stain across my tongue. I found myself standing on the edge of the frozen lake, its surface a vast, scarred mirror reflecting the bruised sky. The ice groaned, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated not just in my ears, but in my very teeth, tasting of bitter almonds and an impossible, shimmering violet. Each step I took onto its glassy expanse sent a ripple of icy blue through my vision, a sensation of shattering glass inside my own skull. My balance faltered, not from the slick surface, but from the sudden, disorienting feeling that the ground beneath me was not solid, but fluid, shifting like dense oil. A phantom pain bloomed in my left hand, a searing ache where no wound existed, as if a limb had been torn away moments before, leaving only a memory of its absence. Then, just as swiftly, the pain migrated, settling in my sternum, a deep, crushing pressure that made breathing a conscious, agonizing effort. My reflection stared back at me from the ice, but it was not truly my own. The face was too long, the eyes too wide, the mouth a thin, cruel line. Its features writhed, subtly shifting, as if the underlying bone structure were made of wax. I raised my hand, and the reflection mirrored the gesture, but its fingers were elongated, tipped with nails that seemed to stretch and sharpen. This was the face, I realized, the impossible impression from my mind, now made manifest through the distortion of my own form. It was me, but not me. It was the raw, unadorned truth of what I was becoming. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and damp earth, yet the sky remained clear. I felt my shoulders broaden, my spine lengthen, a subtle internal architecture rearranging itself, without any external sign. My muscles twitched and rippled beneath my clothes, not with voluntary movement, but with an autonomic, alien rhythm. I was a puppet, and my own flesh was the strings, dancing to a silent, ancient tune. You have seen the weave, Cole. You have felt the threads. Now, become the tapestry. The words were not heard, but felt, a series of resonant vibrations that rearranged my internal organs, squeezing them into new, impossible configurations. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ice, the impact sending a flash of emerald green through my vision, tasting of bitter ash. As I lay there, my body a battleground of warring sensations, the truth finally coalesced, not as a thought, but as an overwhelming, undeniable knowing. Reality was not a construct to be observed, but a perception to be maintained. And I, Cole, the archivist, the cataloger of forgotten truths, had merely glimpsed the indifferent, elder entity that spun the illusion. It was not a being outside reality, but the very fabric of it, the boundless, unthinking force that permitted existence. My insidious presence, the woven thread in my mind, was not an observer, but the first delicate tendril of its true self, blossoming within me. My senses, once my anchors, had become the conduits for this horrifying revelation. They had not betrayed me by failing, but by succeeding too well, by showing me what was always there, beyond the veil of human comprehension. The shifting of my form intensified. My bones felt like shifting sand within my flesh, and my skin, no longer my own, stretched taut, thin as parchment. I was dissolving, not into nothingness, but into everything. The ice beneath me began to crack, not with the weight of my body, but in intricate, geometric patterns that mirrored the impossible blueprints I had once meticulously studied. I was not falling into the lake, but becoming the lake, becoming the ice, becoming the truth. My final breath was not a gasp of air, but a silent, resounding OM*, echoing through the newly vast, indifferent chambers of my dissolving self.